Over the last few months and weeks, you have definitely seen the UFC give Dagestani fighters some big opportunities here in terms of some of the matchups. And in today's video, I'm going to explain why I think that's the case. And I think every fighter has something different as to why they're getting the opportunity that they're getting. That's what we're going to discuss here. We're not going to talk about whether it's fair or not. But I think a good place to start here is the fact that Abu Dhabi has been a hotbed for the UFC over the last couple of years, starting with the pandemic, them going over there. From what I hear, Abu Dhabi takes very good care of the UFC when it comes to expenses, when it comes to so many different things. And if you look at internationally, Abu Dhabi, with the fact that there's a huge Muslim audience, I should say, that watches MMA, and you see the numbers on YouTube, you see the amount of interest that's there, it is a big hotbed for the UFC right now, similar to how Canada was a few years ago, or I should say a decade ago, when George St. Pierre was fighting, Brazil as well. The UFC has identified this as a big market for them, so that's why they're pushing some of these fights, in my opinion. And we're going to start first with the fight that, I did a video on this, not a big fan of the fight, but I am going to explain why I think this fight's happening, and that is Abus Magomedov and Sean Strickland. I mean, on the surface of this, Abus Magomedov defeating a guy, just one fight in the UFC, that's 1-4. It doesn't really make a lot of sense from a merit standpoint, but when you look at it from the standpoint of the fact that the UFC's middleweight division is going through a bit of a transition period, and part of that is the fact that Israel Adesanya has defeated a lot of the fighters in the weight class already. Robert Whittaker, Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, Paulo Costa are just names of some of the fighters that Israel's already defeated. So they are trying to create new stars. And like I said, Abu Dhabi being one of their biggest markets, Muslim fighters being some of their biggest audience, that's why they're trying to create these new stars. So I get it. Like, again, UFC, at the end of the day, they're about doing two things. They're about making money, and they're about having exciting fights. And Abus Magomedov does both of those things. Again, internationally, from what I hear behind the scenes, Abus Magomedov is a big draw for the UFC internationally as well. And it's also the perfect storm of him fighting Sean Strickland. Sean wanted to fight, right, as soon as possible. I still think they could have done that fight with him and Drakus, but that's a video for another day. But Strickland will fight anyone. So it's kind of the perfect storm here, right? You've got Sean Strickland who will fight anyone. I think the UFC is kind of mixed on Strickland personally. Again, like, he is for all of us out here, I think he's very entertaining. He's like a natural comedian with some of the stuff he says. I don't agree with everything he says, obviously, but I think the UFC is a bit worried about Strickland as well, because, they're owned by Disney. Some of the stuff that Strickland says, a lot of the stuff Strickland says, is not exactly politically correct here. So if Abus wins, you have a fighter that, again, they can say beat a top opponent, top ranked opponent, and they can sort of push that going forward. And if Strickland wins, again, Strickland, whether the UFC cares about the stuff he says or not, he's still a guy that people are interested in. Again, if you look at the viewership for Strickland, there is a lot of interest in things that he has to say as well. So I think that's part of it as far as them putting them together. I've also heard behind the scenes that Strickland's been paid very well for this fight. So I think the UFC recognizes, hey, look, you're fighting a guy who's got, Abus has a lot more to gain from this fight than Sean Strickland does. Let's put it that way. And here's another thing I'll throw at you guys as well. They just announced that the UFC is returning to Sydney. I think undoubtedly Israel Adesanya is going to be headlining that card. Is the winner of Robert Whittaker and Drakus du Plessis going to be ready in time? I don't know. I have my doubts, right? Don't be surprised if the winner of this fight inserts into that title fight, because, again, as we've seen over the last month and a bit, the UFC doesn't care about the rankings. So if Abus wins, they can argue it as, well, he just beat a top-ranked guy and he'll get the title shot. If Strickland wins, remember last year at the presser at UFC 276 when Strickland basically destroyed Israel Adesanya verbally? I mean, he owned that press conference last year. More people were talking about that than anything that Israel and Pereira had going on, in terms of, Pereira fighting Strickland and all that. So I wouldn't be surprised if these guys might be able to insert themselves into the title picture with a win here. I know that sounds crazy, but I wouldn't put it past the UFC at this point. So, the other thing I'll mention, Yuri Prochazka, he had 2 UFC fights as well. He got a title shot too. Now that was a bit of a different scenario with the fact that Prochazka was a champion and risen, and I think they use that as a way to kind of justify his title shot as well. Not to mention the fact Yuri's super entertaining, much like Abus Magomedov is as well. So that's why I think Abus is kind of his own case here. I think out of all the matchups that were announced in terms of merit, this is probably one of the worst ones they could have done. But again, this is why this fight is happening, in my opinion. Okay, let's talk about Umar Nurmagomedov, and we got to mention that the fight with Umar and Cory Sandhagen, not official yet, so this might not even happen, but I have a feeling it will happen, and I'm going to explain why I think this is the case. So bantamweight's in a bit of a weird spot. As deep as the division is, you've got Sterling at the top, which I kind of feel like the UFC is not a huge fan of Sterling to a certain degree. They announced this fight with Sean O'Malley. From what I'm hearing behind the scenes, that fight's not signed yet. The UFC typically does that. And then you've got the situation with Merab and Sterling not wanting to fight each other because they're teammates. So they need another contender in bantamweight to kind of bypass all that. And like I said in my video, I understand this matchup more than others, the Umar matchup with Cory Sandhagen. Yes, he's skipping the line as far as moving up the rankings, but he's undefeated. That's something you can sell. And again, having that Nurmagomedov last name as well, that's a huge selling point for the UFC internationally. So that's why I think the Umar fight definitely makes some sense in terms of what the UFC is trying to accomplish here. The other thing with this as well is that Cory Sandhagen is one of those guys that will fight anyone. I have a short clip on my channel about him talking about his decision to call out Magomedov instead of Sean O'Malley because he thinks it's a tougher fight. And there's fans that are crapping on this, but that's just the type of fighter that Cory is. He'll fight anyone. It's not about the money or any of this stuff. For him, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the fact that he wants to challenge himself. And I could see this being a big challenge. Imagine him being able to hand Umar Nurmagomedov his first loss potentially. That's why I think this fight will happen, because Cory wants to do it. And here's the other thing you got to remember. If they do end up doing Sterling and O'Malley, which I think will happen, I think they'll figure something out there. Cory's got to keep active. He's not going to wait around for the winner of that fight. Magomedov looks like he's fighting Henry Cejudo. It does make sense to keep Cory active as well, whether you think Umar deserves it or not. It does make sense from that perspective, just the circumstances of the division right now. So that's one thing you got to remember as well. And not to mention the fact that, like I said, Umar's not boring. We saw the last fight, him get a nice finish there. They're really going to go for that as well. So we'll see what happens. And again, I think this is a fight that potentially could have title shot implications here, with the winner of this getting a title shot. I know that's crazy that if Umar beats, one ranked opponent, he gets a title shot, but don't be surprised if that happens. And I think if you're Cory Sandhagen, you beat an undefeated prospect in Umar Nurmagomedov, I think that's justifiable for a title shot as well. I mean, people bring up the loss to Aljamain Sterling. That was 3 years ago. Cory Sandhagen is nowhere near the same fighter at that point. So again, a lot of interesting things with this potential matchup, which, like I said, not officially booked yet. Okay, let's talk about Ikram. The fighter who's going to be taking on Paulo Costa. He is 14-1. This is another interesting scenario. Again, it goes back with the whole situation, like I mentioned earlier, where there's a lack of contenders at middleweight. So again, they're trying to build up Abus Magomedov. Ikram's another guy they want to build up as well. And by the way, both these guys are extremely talented. Like, I get it. But, if we're going by merit, Ikram's coming off a win over Phil Hawes, who's been knocked out in 3 of his last 4 fights. Phil Hawes is barely holding on to a job in the UFC right now. And I think this was a tailor-made matchup for Ikram to go out there and showcase his stuff here. So, again, and then look at who he's fighting in Paulo Costa. There's a couple things with Paulo Costa we got to mention, right? Paulo Costa had to withdraw from that fight against Robert Whittaker back in 2021. That was a big fight that unfortunately didn't come to fruition. And then the Jared Cannonier fight, which, I mean, everyone was under the assumption that was going to happen. He had some contract issues with the UFC. Now, they've since sorted that out, but I kind of get the opinion that the UFC is not really eager on getting Paulo Costa, back in the title picture. I think they're I know they gave him a new contract, but I think with Paulo Costa, he's a guy that the UFC is not that high on these days. Again, you just look at the fact that he hasn't been that active since 2019. Paulo Costa's fought 4 times. And to me, this is a win-win situation for the UFC. If Ikram wins, which I think there's a possibility for sure that he could do that, you've got a new contender in the division, right? Not to mention the fact Ikram's last loss was against Khamzat Chimaev. Chimaev's talking about going up to 185. That's a perfect revenge fight. They could do that down the line as well, too. So don't put it past the UFC as well that they might set that fight up as well. And then if Paulo Costa wins, same deal as Sean Strickland, they could sell a rematch against Israel Adesanya as well down the line if Paulo Costa gets back at Ikram as well. Down the line, I'm saying. Obviously, I don't think he'll get that fight on the Sydney card, but I'm just saying in general, the UFC kind of looks at it that way. So that's why I think this fight was put together as well. Again, if we're going off merit, right, you get one fight in the UFC and you're fighting Paulo Costa. I know a lot of people have pointed out that Paulo Costa's wins have not aged very well. Rockhold not in the UFC. He lost to Vettori and Adesanya. Yoel Romero not in the UFC. Uriah Hall not in the UFC. Johnny Hendricks not in the UFC. At the time, they were good fights, and maybe not Rockhold, but I think that was more of a case of Rockhold needed to fight someone. It's not like Paulo Costa's picking and choosing his opponents. I think that's a key thing here when you're kind of looking at Paulo Costa as well. So again, that's why I think this matchup in the middleweight division is getting made. And one other name I'm going to throw at you, and I know he's not Dagestani, and I don't want people, roasting me in the comments for this, but this recent fight they announced between Rinat and Kevin Lee, obviously he's Russian, but he's not Dagestani, but same sort of idea here. This is a very good fight here for Rinat. Kevin Lee back in the UFC. Everyone thought, maybe he's going to fight like a Michael Chiesa or Tony Ferguson. They'll give him kind of a fun veteran fight. No, this to me says they're using Kevin Lee, and the reason they brought him back after just one fight is because they're going to use him to build up other prospects. And that's exactly what this looks like. Now, merit-wise, I have no issues with this fight, just with the fact that Renat's got 2 UFC fights. Kevin Lee, I don't think is a ranked welterweight at this point. I don't consider him that, even though, like I said, we don't really pay too much attention to the rankings. He's 2-0 in the UFC. He looked great in that fight against Brian Battle. This is a very favorable matchup here for Rinat in this fight. And, you know, again, this will be a good win on his resume because the way the UFC can sell this is, oh, he just beat a former interim title challenger in Kevin Lee. And if you look at it traditionally, Kevin Lee has not performed that well at welterweight. I think Kevin Lee is one of those fighters that is best at 155, but he's had issues making the weight. He's missed weight a number of times. And I like Kevin Lee a lot, but, you know, at his age, at 30, like, what are you getting with him at this point? Even that fight with Diego Sanchez, he had an Eagle FC. He didn't look that good. So to me, this is a tailor-made matchup for Rinat as they look to continue building him up as a contender in the welterweight division. And, you know, I think middleweight's a lot worse in terms of how they're really trying to build some new stars. I wouldn't say worse, but I'm just saying that they're trying to build new stars. But look at all the you know, the new fighters that are coming up in this weight class. Jack Della Maddalena getting a pretty good fight, pretty good opportunity and fight against Sean Brady. You got Ian Gary, who just won, you know, recently. They're trying to build him up as well as a new contender. And I would put Rinat in that category too, because I think if he beats Kevin Lee, they will put him in the rankings or at least close to it. A lot of these guys, Luque, Jeff Neal, Thompson, Burns, a lot of these guys are on their way out. I think they're not going to be fighting for a title anytime soon. So I think Rinat is another name that they're trying to push as well. Again, he's not Muslim, he's not Dagestani, but actually he might be Muslim, I'm not sure. But either way, they're trying to build him up as well. And you're sort of seeing this theme of the UFC kind of building up international fighters as well. So that's pretty much my thoughts on everything. Like, again, people act like I'm surprised by some of these matchups getting put together. I'm not. The UFC has always been about making the fights that are going to make them money and giving entertaining fights as well. It's the same reason why Yoel Romero got a title shot against Israel Adesanya coming off a loss. It's the same reason why Chael Sonnen got a title shot coming off a loss. This is how the UFC has always done business. And again, I've said this before, they should just throw the rankings in the garbage if this is the way they're going to go with it. But like, I get it. That's kind of what the whole point of this video is as well. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you agree, disagree with me here on some of these points? I know I said some crazy stuff here in terms of what the potential winners could get, but I wouldn't put it past the UFC at this point. Again, we've seen their matchmaking recently very favorable towards the Dagestani fighters especially. And what was the big narrative a couple years ago? I shouldn't even say a couple. It was like, you know, a while ago, Khabib and Islam, they don't want to prop them up. They don't want to, you know, they don't want to give them good fights. And I think now you're seeing the opposite. But again, it's because they're seeing the value in a lot of these fighters and how they can bring an audience internationally. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram @Lynch on Sports. I'm James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.